The news that Jimin and Jungkook flew to Japan without Hybe's knowledge immediately sparked a huge wave of reaction. Sensational titles sprang up, the narrative progressed quickly, and the public's emotions were dragged along. It was mentioned that the agency side was angry and surprised, while the trip itself was described as a sudden step off the beaten track. But behind the cacophony, the story formed is much more complex than just black and white between permission and anger. It all started with an unexpected arrival. When information about Jimin and Jungkook's landing in Japan spread, the public was left wondering. There were no previous official announcements, no open schedules, and no immediate context explaining the reasons for the trip. In an industry accustomed to measured transparency, this silence fuels speculation. From there came the narrative that Hybe didn't know and was not ready for the move. However, in the world of entertainment on a global scale, the absence of announcements does not always mean the absence of communication. Many agendas are flexible, dynamic, and not always made public for the sake of privacy and security. Nevertheless, news of a violent internal reaction continued to roll in. It is mentioned that the internal atmosphere becomes tense due to the unusual timing of the trip, especially when the public spotlight is high and every step of the artist has a big impact. Jimin and Jungkook themselves are depicted as being in a different emotional state from the hot outside narrative. Their arrival in Japan was marked by a sense of relief. After a long period full of changes of plans, pressure, and exhausting travel, Japan feels like a safe spot. The relief was evident from the body language, from the slower pace, and from the unencumbered expression. The contrast between their calmness and the clamor of the news further magnifies the impression of conflict. This is where the story begins to split. On the one hand, there is the narrative that the agency felt left out, worried about precedent, and did not want the impression to appear that the artist was moving out of coordination. On the other hand, there is an understanding that Jimin and Jungkook are mature figures with long experience, who are in a phase of life and career in which the need for personal space is becoming increasingly important. The tension that the public is talking about is more correctly understood as a clash of rhythms, rather than open rebellion that Hybe is known as a highly structured company. Systems, schedules, and communications become the operational backbone. So when there is a trip that does not follow the usual announcement pattern, it is natural that there is a strong reaction at the management level. But angry in this context is often oversimplified by the media. Behind that word can be worry, intense discussion, and internal evaluation. Not just raw emotion. For Jimin and Jungkook, the trip to Japan seemed more of a need for stability. After a barrage of agendas and uncertainties, they need a place that gives a sense of security and order. Japan, with its orderly rhythm of life and calm atmosphere, meets that need. The decision to fly, which some have called abrupt, feels more like a recovery move than an act of challenging the system. The public was divided. Some are apprehensive, fearing the long-term impact on artist and agency relationships. Others instead showed support, judging that artists also have the right to determine their breaks and safe spaces. The discussion extends to a larger issue: the extent to which individual freedoms can coexist with the entertainment industry's vast system. Amid all that, what is often missed is the fact that no official statement actually confirms the extreme details of the narrative in circulation. Many things move in the realm of assumptions and interpretations. The official silence actually made the wild story develop. But for those watching closely, the visible signs suggest something calmer. No overt escalation, no drastic steps, just an ongoing adjustment phase. Jimin and Jungkook chose to focus on recovery. The days in Japan they live in a slower rhythm. The relief felt on landing becomes the foundation for reorganizing energy. In that calm, subsequent decisions will be taken with a cool head both by the artist and by the agency. Ultimately, the stories of angry Hybe and flying without knowledge will probably be remembered as moments when the public witnessed the natural friction between the system and people, not as a divisive conflict, but rather as a maturing process. The industry moves fast, expectations are high, and pressure is great. In the midst of it all, Jimin and Jungkook's trip to Japan becomes a mirror that calm is sometimes sought not to fight, but to survive. This story is not over. But one thing is clear. Behind the loud headlines and heated speculation, there are two individuals who landed safely, felt relief, and chose to calm down. And often, it is the calm that is the beginning of the most adult settlement. As time went on, the narrative of Hybe's anger slowly began to shift. The initially heated public discussion began to enter a more reflective phase. Many parties realized that this story is not as simple as no permission or against the agency. In an industry of this magnitude, decisions rarely stand alone. There are layers of communication, context, and internal dynamics that are not always visible from the outside. What is increasingly clear is the difference in point of view between the system and the individual. From the management side, sudden trips always trigger concerns about safety, image, and long-term impact. Any movement of global artists carries great consequences, and unpredictability is often perceived as a risk. But from the side of Jimin and Jungkook, a trip to Japan feels like an urgent need for calm. In the midst of mounting pressure, quick decisions are sometimes the only way to maintain balance. And Japan, the atmosphere they live in confirms that even more. There are no signs of excessive euphoria, no conspicuous activity indicating a defiant attitude. Their days are filled with a simple and orderly rhythm. The relief they felt upon landing turned into a steady calm. This is not an escape, but rather a recovery. Industry sources are beginning to point out that the so-called outrage is more correctly understood as the evaluation phase. The internal discussion went intensely, not to punish, but to realign the rhythm. In long-term relationships between artists and agencies, moments like this are almost inevitable. This is the point where trust is tested, communication is improved, and new boundaries are defined. For fans, this phase is full of emotions. There is anxiety, there is anger at narratives that are considered superfluous, and there is hope that everything will be resolved in an adult way. Many began to see the trip to Japan as a signal that Jimin and Jungkook were taking care of themselves. Not to get away, but to be able to return with a healthier condition, both physically and mentally. The continuing official silence makes room for one important understanding. Not all conflicts need to be announced, and not all tensions need to be shown. In many cases, the best completion occurs away from the spotlight. Japan, with its tranquility, becomes the perfect setting to lower the emotional temperature, both for artists and for the system that shelters them. In the end, this story begins to look not as a crisis, but as a transition. A moment in which a long-running work relationship needs to adjust to a new reality. Jimin and Jungkook are no longer figures who just move with the flow, and Hybe is not just a single controller without dialogue. Between the two, there is a reasonable negotiation process in the long course of a global career. As the spotlight slowly subsides, what remains is one simple but powerful conclusion. This trip to Japan, however controversial on the surface, is essentially about relief and continuity. About choosing to calm down so that you can step again more fully. And in a world that moves as fast as the entertainment industry, perhaps it is precisely silent measures like these that are most needed to keep things on their feet.